It is a pleasure to be here. I've never been in Kentucky before, so when Kevin asked me to come down here, I was just delighted. And because this is an election year, it's particularly appropriate that the things I'm going to be talking about today are going to have a lot of political content. The question I'm asking is really, how did we get here? How did the juvenile justice system get to the place it is today? And I'm going to look at the social history of the juvenile court over the past half century through the prism of race. Because my argument throughout is it's about race, stupid, or it's about political economy and race. And I'm going to argue that race has had two distinct and contradictory roles in juvenile justice policy over the past half century. In the 1950s and in the 1960s, race gave us the due process revolution and the Warren Court. And social, structural, and political forces that were operating earlier in the century impelled the Warren Court to decide civil rights cases and criminal procedure cases and the juvenile justice cases. And it was in response to that in the 1980s and the 1990s that we saw the emergence of the second role of race in public policy, which was the emergence of the Get Tough movement. And this was really a political reaction to the 1960s rights revolution, as well as to escalating crime rates in the 1960s and 1970s, and to the race riots of the 1960s. And during this period, Republicans launched appeals for law and order as a way to appeal to white Southern voters and what we have been seeing over the past several decades of the Republican Southern strategy. So I'm really going to be talking about the politics of crime, and particularly the impact of the politics of crime on the Get Tough changes in juvenile justice of the early 1990s. And through all of this, I'm also going to be weaving the role of the media as an intervening variable in the way in which it shapes our perceptions of reality and has supported policies to get tough on youth. So what I'm going to try to do is treat the juvenile court as a dependent variable. And I'm going to be focusing both on changes in law in the 1960s as the dependent variable, the procedural changes of the 60s, as well as the substantive changes of the 1980s and the 1990s, and looking at social structural changes, racial changes, demographic changes, political changes, media changes as the independent variables affecting the changes in procedure and the changes in substance. And so in order to conduct that sort of inquiry, I'm going to be asking and answering two sets of questions. The first is, why did the Warren Court happen when it did and as it did? And the second is, why did the Get Tough conservative backlash happen when it did and as it did? And my argument is, in both instances, it's the politics of race. And the simple thesis is, first the North went south, and then the South went north. And that's sort of the mnemonic to get the handle on the two roles that race has had. The first part of the story really begins in the early 1900s, and it's when the great migration of blacks from the rural South to the urban North began and made race a national issue rather than a Southern regional issue, and eventually led to the civil rights movement that was exemplified by the decisions of the Warren Court. The Great Migration began during the period around World War I, when European immigration was curtailed and provided the opportunity for blacks to migrate from the rural South to begin working in the factories that previously were being manned by European immigrants. So between 1910 and 1920, about 500,000 blacks left the South. Between 1920 and 1930, about 750,000 more blacks left the South. Between the periods of World War I and World War II, we also saw changes in Southern cotton agriculture and the mechanization of cotton picking. And, sort of when I tell this story, it's sort of, the reason everything happened is because of the Mexican boll weevil, that the boll weevil came up and devastated the cotton crops and destroyed the Southern cotton industry. And that's why the blacks had to leave the South to move up to the cities of the North. During the Depression, there was additional impetus to move, and by World War II, all of the men were off fighting in the war, and so there were all of the opportunities in factories, both for blacks and for women. You know, Rosie the Riveter was the female equivalent of the blacks working in factories. When blacks moved from the rural South, they moved to cities. In 1910, about a quarter of blacks lived in cities. In 1940, half of blacks lived in cities. By 1960, three-quarters of blacks lived in cities. So we're talking about both the Great Migration and the urbanization of blacks occurring simultaneously. You know, to give you perspective, in 1870, 80% of blacks lived in the rural South. By 1970, 80% of blacks lived in cities, and more than half of them were living outside of the South. So that when they moved to the cities, we also saw the beginning, after World War II, of the processes of ghettoization. Because at the same time blacks were moving into the cities, whites were beginning the process in the post-World War II period of moving out to the suburbs. And federal housing policies, tax policies, mortgage policies, and highway policies all contributed to the migration of whites from the cities to the suburbs as blacks were pouring into the cities and the processes of ghettoization. During the post-World War II period, race finally became a national issue. In 1948, the Democratic Party for the first time adopted a strong civil rights plank. And Strom Thurmond ran for president in 1948 and won in 4 southern states. We'll come back to Strom Thurmond when I talk about Trent Lawton a little bit. But this is really all part of the beginning of the realization that race was going to provide a basis for political realignment in American public policy discussions. Even though there was the recognition that we had to deal with the American dilemma, the federal Congress was immobilized because of white Southern congressional domination of the entire committee structure of federal government, so that there was no impetus for urban policies, for civil rights policies, for education policies, and the like. At the same time, the U.S. was involved in a conflict with the Soviet Union, and we were trying to appeal to all of the decolonizing nations in the Third World. So we had a problem. On the one hand, we wanted to be the bastions of democracy, and on the other hand, we were practicing segregation and racial discrimination at home, and our political process was incapable of responding to that. So that it fell to the Supreme Court to deal with the problem of race in American policy and in American politics. And the Great Migration had also changed the politics of the presidencies and the processes of the justices who were being named to the Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court had actually become aware of the issues of race back in the 1930s, when it dropped the famous footnote 4 in United States versus Caroline Products, in which the court said, we're going to start strictly scrutinizing state laws that affect discrete and insular minorities. And everybody knew that discrete and insular minorities was the Supreme Court's way of saying, we're worried about the way the South is treating blacks, and we're particularly worried about the political process and people being able to participate democratically in the political process. And the Supreme Court was just sort of giving itself the authority in that footnote 4 to deal with what was the Southern regional exceptionalism to the general national policies. That in the South, you know, and it's sort of, I was telling Kevin that this is really sort of the story of my life. I'm going to talk about Brown v. Board, and I understand there's another discussion going on about Brown v. Board, but, you know, it's sort of, I was part of that, you know, beginning of the Brown v. Board of Education processes of change. I grew up in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, and went to segregated schools when I was a kid, because Washington was still a southern city at that particular time.